Welcome to Live Free, Ride Free, where we talk to people who have lived self-actualized lives on their own terms and find out how they got there, what they do, how we can get there, what we can learn from them, how to live our best lives, find our own definition of success, and most importantly, find joy. I'm your host, Rupert Isaacson, New York Times best-selling author of The Horse Boy, founder of New Trails Learning Systems and LongRideHome.com. You can find details of all our programs and shows on rupertisaacson.com. Welcome back to Live Free, Ride Free. Today I've got someone who, if you open the dictionary and you look at self-actualized, you're going to find a picture of Ginny Jordan. She really ought to be in the Oxford Dictionary. Ginny Jordan is someone I've been privileged to know for quite a few years. And those of you who know my work with Horseboy Movement Method and those therapeutic approaches that we do, I can say that they wouldn't exist without the influence of Ginny Jordan. But I'm not the only one. I would say that of the people I know who have had a positive effect upon the planet and our species and other species associated with us, I don't really know anyone who has done more than Ginny Jordan. She's many things. She has been and still is a film producer of very cutting edge films that you may know, which we'll talk about later, all of which have served a social purpose, but have also been just jolly good films in their own right. She has founded and headed an amazing initiative for first women in Africa. And then I think it's gone beyond that with HIV to micro fund to set up businesses, which I know has gone bananas in the world. She is involved with regenerative farming. She's involved with feminism. She's involved with healing. She is a healer. And maybe actually it's not so much self-actualized. I'm just looking in the dictionary now under the word awesome. And look, there's another picture of Ginny Jordan. So Ginny.
Well, in the moment, I'm completely delighted, amused, and enjoying being here. So thanks for having me. Who I am, wow. I think you said a lot. I'm a multidimensional being. And, if you tie me down in a room, I'm an unhappy person. I need to manifest. I need to express. Since I was little, there was a deep, just inherent call to give of myself to the world in any ways that I could find that felt true and honest and felt would actually serve. So, who am I? Someone that cares deeply. I mean, almost to the point of tears most of the time. It's like my heart is just constantly full of a depth of caring for who we are as a species, where we're headed, where we seem to be not headed. But it's just an impossibility for me to turn away.
Okay, so you have manifested so much for so many. We're going to go into that, all the extraordinary things that you've done and are still doing. I want to ask you to take us back to that moment when you were a little girl and you said you felt that calling. Do you remember that moment? Can you take us there?
Well, I think there were like kind of two distinct moments that come up. The first, which I haven't talked about in a long time, I was probably 6 or 7. And I woke up in the middle of the night, which apparently felt like a nightmare, but it was wasn't really a nightmare content and dreams. It was just, I had a revelation at night. And I woke up with this deep, profound, heavy feeling that there had to be more than life than the scripts that we were given. You're supposed to grow up, you're supposed to get married, you're supposed to kind of have children, then you're supposed to do this, you're supposed to do that, and then it's over. Well done. Or you could, maybe there are 3 scripts, but I saw through sort of the nature of existence, if you will, in a moment, in a flash. And I knew there had to be more. I knew there was some other mysterious thing going on that was much larger than this linear content that seemed to be already laid out in front of me. And I went into pretty deep depression. I tried to talk to my mother about it, and she just thought I was thoroughly crazy. What's a 7-year-old thinking about such big arcs of future? But I was. And that was a real awakening moment and a kind of an insistence and a contract that I signed that there has to be something more to this existence than just certainly going through the motions. But I didn't know what it was, but I signed a contract to find out.
You said there were two moments, right? So
Yeah.
what?
So that was one. The
Yeah,
second one was I would get on the school bus and I would pretended that I had a wand. This is sort of embarrassing that I had a
brilliant.
wand. And anytime I saw what looked like a suffering or suddenly I would see a tow truck carrying a car and oh my goodness, that probably involved an accident, and I'm like secretly blessing as though I have that power as a little one that I could bless, those who might be injured or hurt or that I could see out the window. And I often would kind of put the wand under imagined wand, I didn't have a real wand, under my pillow at night, and felt prepared in the morning to bless. And I have no idea where that came from. It's
That
not like I had a parent modeling that, but there was a deep, that's when I began ever so slowly to wake up to just the fact that I cared. And not that everybody should have that particular destiny, but it was very clear. It's like, wow, I really cared about that person who was on the sidewalk limping. I really cared about what something that might have looked marginalized or
where was
different.
this? Where were you on a school bus? What part of America?
I grew up in Ohio, in a very small town outside of Toledo, Ohio, fairly rural existence on a river. My parents were, at this point, quite involved in environmental conservation work, so they modeled love of land and care for the earth for me. I got to sort of live and breathe that without really knowing what was happening.
Why did they do that?
I think it was rooted my mother was involved in the Nature Conservancy from almost its inception, and for many years was on the national board, like 30 years of her life, and I think it came from, their love of the solitude that they found when they were in the natural world. They were also hunters, fishermen, women, and loved land. And I'm not sure where I could tell you where that actually when I look to the
Was
next
that a
generation.
tradition in the family that they fished, they hunted, they
Yeah,
did duck shooting and wanted to conserve the marshes, that sort of thing?
yeah.
Yeah,
The very beginning of Nature Conservancy was about that, just conservation.
absolutely.
Of course, it
Um,
evolved, and needed to.
what were they doing? What was their profession?
My father was a real entrepreneur. He bought sort of a bankrupt business and got a loan from his father and, built it into a very, very successful manufacturing company. He manufactured doors, front entry doors, and he was very intuitive and he anticipated sort of the energy crisis in the 60s and he'd already designed a wood door a fiberglass door that looked like wood that was highly energy efficient. So he had a kind of remarkable talent of sort of forecasting. Um,
So he was a manifester,
Definitely.
and your
As
mother was a carer of the land, also your father.
and also a big manifester and a
Okay.
leader and a leader
And
in the
yet, and yet when you came to your mum as a 6, 7-year-old with this revelation, instead of going, well, you're clearly, following in the footsteps of all the wise women, well done for showing up. And now we begin your priestess training. She rolled her eyes. Given that she was a manifester and a carer of the land, why do you think she had that reaction?
I think it, just imagine that generation's, sort of fixation on pretty limited scripts.
This is
They
what
weren't
year would you say?
well, I was born in 53, so this was probably and I was maybe 7, 8, something like that.
About 1958, 960, somewhere in there.
Yeah. I think, it was a radical idea
Yeah.
that maybe these scripts are fundamentally limited and, who said that we should sort of fulfill it as it's laid out sort of traditionally, culturally. And I think that was just a little over their heads. I also think that I was speaking to some mystery of life that was much larger, and I don't think it certainly was not a religious orientation because they didn't have that, but I think I had a sort of a deep spiritual kind of knowing that they didn't understand at all.
It did when she had that reaction to you, what was your reaction?
Oh, I shut down.
But it didn't shut you down from using your magic wand on the school bus.
No, didn't, but, that's kind of like a secret activity, right? No one really knows I have a magic wand.
I know you have a magic wand, and I've been watching out the
Right,
last
but
25 years. We're going to go into that. And it's
yeah,
really
well,
interesting to me. I've often wondered where your shamanic ability to manifest extraordinary things on an extraordinary scale came from. And you telling me that story in all the years I've known you, I haven't known that. I think it should be on the school curriculum. I think that as soon as you get on the school bus, they should
get your
give you
wand.
your what magic
Oh,
wand and say,
absolutely.
here is how you use it and here's how you do not use it. And can you imagine
It'd be
how
amazing.
different the world would look?
Amazing. Yeah.
Every kid
Well,
riding on the school bus.
yeah, and I certainly felt, sort of secretly powerful. Not as, dominant, of course, I'm young, but more that wow, I could have an influence with my little wand. I could help heal someone. I could help them feel better. I
Well, that,
could I
yeah,
could make sense out of some things that didn't make sense, bring order.
there's no question you've been doing that ever since. I'm
Yep.
going to talk to you later about this. I think it should be a whole curriculum. I think this is something I'd really like to pursue. And in the
Great.
work we do in schools and stuff. This is genius. So perhaps we could have that conversation. I think we need to give all these kids magic wands. Okay.
Oh
So
my
now you blow my mind with your magic wand. Okay. So now, but I have to retrieve my mind. Otherwise there will be no podcast. Take us to the next thing. Okay. Now you go from little girl beginning to do her first imagining, harnessing her imagination into manifestation in a way
yeah.
that is through caring, really compassion. At what point do you begin to put that into action? Tell us about your college years. Where did you go to college? How was that? What years were those?
Oh, yeah, I'm terrible. Just don't even go there. It's like I can't
Born in
map my
53, so
yeah,
70,
you do the math.
70?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Well, I went to boarding school, which was utterly a disaster. It was like putting the wrong bean in the wrong context with all girls. I grew up with 4 brothers, and that was strange and heartbreaking, and I knew, back to this original story I just told you, that somehow that cultural layout, which I was supposed to go to boarding school, then was supposed to go to Vassar, where my mom went. My brother's supposed to go to Yale, where he went, and then I'm gonna marry, some amazing, businessman, and I'm gonna be president of the junior league someday, and it was all sort of scripted. And so I ended up, after boarding school, I went to a very, very radical, extreme experimental college in California from
Presumably by your own design, not by your mother's design.
yeah, and a bit of a synchronistic happening on the shores of Crete in
Tell us
Greece.
about that.
When I was 19, I kind of did the big walkabout, the big adventure, and I sat on the beach in a little tiny part of the island that you could only get in by donkey called Vi. And I lived on the beach, kind of did this sort of hippie thing. And a man came up to me and said, "Did you hear about this amazing experimental school that's starting? Some professors from Harvard or whatever, sort of big mucky East Coast have had it, and they want to start this experiment in Southern California using the facilities at the University of Redlands." It was called Johnston College. And, it was one of those moments that we have in a life where there was just a recognition. I went, oh, that's for me. And I checked it out, and I went, and that was seminal in my biography. I experimented with so many things, and as we did as a group, we literally were 200 students that, like, made up. We were collective creators of this experiment, and I studied extraordinary things with extraordinary faculty, and made up my own degree, and it was
What
a
did you
pivot
study?
a pivot moment.
What did you
Mhm.
study? What did you study?
Mostly, well, many things, but my degree was in psychology. I can't even remember the title but it had to do with the integrated child. I did a lot of work with children at the time, and I can't remember the title of it, but it was psychology.
I love the fact that you can't remember the title of your degree.
No,
That's perfect.
no.
But what would you say when you said we experimented? What did you experiment with?
Everything, this was in the early days, the human potential movement. So, we were pounding pillows and saying "fuck you" out the windows to our moms and dads, and it's like heavy duty kind of therapy, but it was all about sort of self discovery. I studied Gestalt Therapy Institute in Los Angeles with the greats of the greats, Fritz Perls, all his proteges. I got Rolfed at 19 years old. We get credit for that. It was like a lot of it was just experimenting. We worked with Jean Houston, studied myth extensively, and actually went through a course with her and Ram Dass and Castaneda, of all people. So some
Very
of the some of the greats in those days were very interested. There were 12 of us that were graduating in the transpersonal psych part of the college, and they were
okay.
our faculty.
So I need to just take a pause because a lot of our listeners don't know who these people were and what some of these things are. And I think we need to talk about this because listeners, those of you who came through the counterculture, I take off my hat because those of us like me who, as dinosaur ancient as I am now, I am still the generation that came from the loins of the people of the counterculture. And I have benefited massively from it. Basically, the hippies paved the way because they knew that there was a better quality of life than a militaristic military industrial complex. And we take for granted the freedoms that we have socially now, but they were not always there. And the people that forged that were the counterculture people of the 60s and early 70s. And obviously, Ginny, you were very much a part of this. And so were these people you're talking about. So we owe a debt of gratitude for the freedoms, not just the political freedoms, but the social and thought freedoms that we have these days, which we take for granted. Stuff that you could see on media today, it was not there before. Okay, so
Yep.
Gestalt therapy, people will not know necessarily what that is, even though it's a legendary thing. Please tell us what is Gestalt therapy?
Well, Fritz Perls was the founder, a very well-known psychologist who really explored sort of the human psyche in terms of parts. So, we have a tyrant in us, we have a rescuer in us, we have a victim, and in his passion was getting into a room and just laying out all the parts and having them all dialogue and act out. And it's very, very sort of active, dynamic, almost on the edge of theatrical expression. So it was a lot about kind of moving places of tension and certainly not being afraid of those places, inviting them. So that was very much what Gestalt is about, is liberating yourself from different parts that don't know the other parts. It's like where we're unconscious and kind of raising to the surface.
Gestalt is, I live in Germany. Gestalt is a German word. It means pattern or
Yeah,
complete, right? So greater than the sum of its parts, I guess. So are you saying it's an integration of all of those
correct.
sides of oneself and sort of recognition of all of those sides of oneself to kind of get self-knowledge?
Yeah, exactly. Well said. Yep. And not done through kind of just talk therapy, sitting, one on one. Often it was done in group work. And so that when you witnessed somebody else's, you know, extremely violent father and the suffering that that person went through, the idea was also that it mirrored something for you. It's like the work was for everybody. It wasn't just sitting in a little cubicle. And that was part of its power at the time. And it's still alive and well. It's nothing like it was in our day. To your point, right? It was the human potential was just just on fire, and we were passionate about discovering who we really were and determined to remove any blocks that particularly that were scripted things that, back to this feeling that we were pushing off a generation of a lot of authority.
You mentioned someone called Jean Houston. Who was she?
She's sort of queen of mythic reality and explored it in so many dimensions. She's a storyteller, kind of a mythic wonder. Could really look at what we would call an archetype and unpack it in the most creative and deliberate way. We went through a year-long course with her that was called Mind Games, where she was really fascinated in exploring what can happen in a group process. Again, kind of a group focus. And a lot of it had to do with developing certain kinds of psychic capacities, certain capacities for attunement, for group mind. Literally, some people would be in the middle of the room and they would kind of facilitate a process where they go into a trance. And I mean, it was pretty wild stuff we were playing with. But she's really an extraordinary mythic scholar. And anybody who hasn't heard of her should definitely look into. She's written many, many, many books and is quite a force.
You mentioned Ram Dass. Who's Ram Dass?
Who's Ram Dass? Very well-known spiritual teacher of the time. I think he passed about, I don't know, five or so years ago. A Harvard dropout psychedelic guy that was absolutely, I mean, his real awakening happening in India and with a guru, but very, very funny, very inspiring, wickedly bright, and had a wonderful way, I mean, a charismatic leader, a wonderful way of sort of helping people remember who they really kind of are, which essentially beings of light is how he would talk about it. And so it was a very devotional path with him.
What was he
And
teaching you guys? Yeah, specifically.
I think he was teaching us really about, again, through a lot of his works. He was most known for a book called Be Here Now. At the time that was kind of a revelatory concept. It's called being present.
Yeah.
Now it's sort of old hat.
Well, this present moment mindfulness shit that we hear all the time, it actually did begin somewhere. Yes.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
It was radical at the time. Yeah.
Yeah. Be Here Now. And that was what he's kind of most known for. But I think he added the heart piece,
Mm.
So, we were pushing off a lot of that generation. We're certainly pushing off the Vietnam War. There's a lot of pushing and kind of fire and insistence on expressing ourselves. And,
Feminism. Yeah.
you can get all those images of, sort of anti-war protests and blah, blah. But he added the heart. And, a lot.
Was he saying you've got to be compassionate towards those who are causing the suffering that is?
I think definitely he would go there. But he was a devotional devotee to his version of God, so to speak, which was a deep spiritual calling for him that Mother India is most known for, and that's where he had his first awakening, and then determination to translate that into Western terms. And as I said, humor was one of his best.
Speaking of humor, can I tell you my Ram Dass story?
Yes, please
I have
do.
a Ram Dass story. I never met Ram Dass, but I did go once to a reading of things by Ram Dass, including from Be Here Now. And I went to the toilet and someone had taped on the urinal, Pee Here Now.
Perfect. Be present. You're peeing. Make sure you get it in the toilet. That's perfect.
No doubt men need reminding of that.
Always.
Okay. You mentioned another name. And by the way, listeners, it's important that you know this because these people are all legends. And we're talking about mentorship here. To be mentored by some of these people was somewhat extraordinary. I didn't know you were mentored by these people. You mentioned Castaneda, Carlos Castaneda. For those of you who do not know who Carlos Castaneda was, Ginny, please tell us.
Well, you know who he is.
Certainly, but not every listener will.
No, but I'd love to hear how you would frame him.
Oh, well, that's a bit unfair. I'm the one I ask the questions here.
But I'm interested in how your generation would.
All right.
This is not
So,
a
so
trick.
when I was a schoolboy, Carlos Castaneda, and my schoolboy. I'm in London. I'm at a very traditional conservative boys' school, which is also part of the military. Blah blah blah. And I was the last generation of boys to be regularly beaten at school, that sort of thing. It was the old Victorian model. And so Carlos Castaneda was one of the influences that came in for rebellion. And Carlos Castaneda was an American who went down to Mexico and wrote a series of books about interactions with a Huichol Indian shaman. Or was he? No, he wasn't Huichol. He was, what's the tribe next to them? Or was he Huichol? Anyway,
I
from
think
that,
you what, Don Juan.
yeah, Don Juan. And for those of you, the Huichols are the ones who do these amazing color patterns, and they're known for their relationship with peyote, which is a hallucinogenic substance and healing medicine in use for thousands of years and still in use in Native America today. But it grows in their area, only grows in a very small area on the Mexican-Texas border and Arizona-Texas border. And so he wrote a series of books about being in apprenticeship to this shaman, Don Juan, and being taken on an ever more sort of ego-destroying series of terrifying hallucinogenic journeys that were extremely influential both as anthropology and as just flat out entertaining writing and as spiritual writing. However, there is, of course, a controversy around him. Many people say he made it all up, and then he ended up with a bit of a sort of sex cult around him or something like that. And then some of those people, and then after he died, some of those people disappeared and perhaps potential foul play and blah, 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 blah. So he's one of these sort of legendary characters who, I look at it from my generation and say, well, I don't know. I don't know whether he made it up. I don't know whether he went. I don't know this. I don't know that. But what I do know is that the books were extremely influential. And for those of us who were sort of suffering in that Victorian model, they served as a window on the potential of what life could look like and potential of human consciousness. That's about all I have to say on Carlos Castaneda. But knew the man, you met the man. What do you have to say about him?
Well, yeah, I understand the controversy. Ultimately, it doesn't matter because
He,
if this was an invention and just imagination, it's pretty brilliant imagination because what it set up, to your point, is this the power of mentorship, of letting, he had to go through all of his Western white control, right, to let go and to be led by this man, not only just through, taking plant medicine, but, crazy trials he put him through. It's like 40 days in the desert kind of trials, coyote kind of operations, right? Where suddenly he's, and he was pushed. It's like a version of an Outward Bound course. And every time he went to see him, and so much of the books and the inspiration are, what it is to let go like that
yeah,
to someone that, again, true or false, made up or not, irrelevant. It's an amazing archetype of what it is to actually break through our kind of cultural addictions
mhm,
to be able to sense life, to open our senses to other realities
yeah,
that, for many indigenous peoples in the world are pre-existing. There's no need to convince. They're operating in an entirely different kind of room in the house, so to speak, than we are. And that's was the revelation of the books. And he was kind of a mixed character. He was actually quite shy.
mhm,
And when he would come to teach, we would all just, be kind of like rapidly trying to pull stuff out of him. It's all such an intriguing story. And he, would offer things, but he was very within himself, quite shy, actually, and didn't have a big need. He was almost self effacing, almost to the point of being self effacing. He didn't have a big need to like blow his horn and say, "Oh my God, I'm amazing." It was like I felt a natural humility in him. So, for whatever that's worth, as I said, I was young and maybe not the full capacity to read character, but a key figure for a young woman for
Well,
sure.
I think, yeah, the point is that he was also a key figure in the counterculture of opening people's minds to
Yeah,
power of indigenous myth as well.
absolutely.
What you just described to me from, that waking up to the school bus with the magic wand to, I love that you put the wand under your pillow at night. I love that. To then this new radical counterculture college is it's basically sounds like Hermione Granger from the Harry Potter series, realizing her magical potential, even though she's, I couldn't remember, she's a muggle, half muggle as well. And then being sent off to Hogwarts to learn the workings of magic. And I think what you've talked about, we're going to go on to the actual things you've done in your life, which are mind blowing in a moment. But it seems that you awoke to intrinsically, but then were also had it nurtured and mentored. If nothing else, the power of the human imagination.
Yeah.
And the older I get, the more convinced I am that this is the most powerful tool we have. And this is the thing that really renders us who we are in terms of this ridiculous power that we wield as a species, for good or ill. Luckily, mostly, I think, for good. I think the story you've just sort of told of the crucible in which that imagination can be, can awake. And then I think it does actually awake in most children spontaneously. Because that's who we are. My earliest memories of walking in my parents' garden in London with the sun shining on a brick wall. It's very early in the morning and it's warm. It's a summer morning and I'm up earlier than all the adults. And the adults don't want to be woken up. So I'm in the garden and there's bees buzzing on the little flowers that are growing out of the wall. And in those bees and in those flowers, I hear God, and God talks to me, and God doesn't give me any revelations. God's just like this nurturing figure. Almost, I can almost feel the hand on my shoulder as I'm walking, just reassuring. And I think that almost every child on the planet has this as their birthright. And then many, many, many children go through something like that imaginary wand thing. And then it's sort of slapped out of them or even just conditioned out of them. And now more than ever through, social media and things like that, the non-interaction with the physical world, the animal world, the human world, and now with screens, which of course themselves are a product of the human imagination and themselves can be wonderful things, but obviously can also be limiting things. So it's easy. We can see that power's unleashed itself in an unlimited way and then comes with its own limitations, and each generation has to come to their own terms with this. But I love that you had that and remember that so clearly. All right, so now you've been mentored by these legends. These guys are all legends. And then you graduate, you go out into the world. What do you do? What's the first thing you do when you get out of college?
Well, I really thought I knew something. So it was kind of total act of arrogance that I went up to Northern California and started training psychiatrists and psychologists.
And they
really
listen
thought,
to you
I
at
really,
12 or whatever you were at that point.
I really thought I knew something. And thank goodness, my version of, God speaking to me said, after a few years of this, I could really feel where it was. I was kind of winging it from the inside. And yes, I was bright. I had things to offer, but it really was not in the depth of my experience. And I just, at some point, I knew that, and that came to an end. And I knew I always wanted to work with people. That was kind of a given. But the form of kind of emerging as this sort of glorious teacher who knew a bunch of things, that needed to sort of kind of have its moment in time, and then it dissolved into something much more authentic and real, which was just part of my ongoing quest anyways. And I then, pretty shortly after that period of time, I got married, and I have had 3 children, and that whole journey at the same time, I continued to work with people, but in a much more sort of modest way. Very fascinated with dream language. That was always a big part of my interior life. I was an active dreamer since I was very young, a prophetic dreamer. I often dreamt things beforehand, which was quite confusing as a little one, but I was fascinated by the language itself of dreams and, how it is that we're speaking to ourselves every night.
What did you say you were working with people, by the way, as a therapist? How were you
Yeah.
working?
as a therapist. Yeah, that's what I got my degree in, and then extra trainings, et cetera. And then I really got involved in dream work specifically and studied with some wonderful Jungian.
Well, that was the question, the natural question to ask was, so Carl Jung, obviously the most prolific writer, or the household name at any rate, in terms
Yep,
of dream work and the interpretation of dreams. Those who don't know who Jung was, Swiss German, early psychologist, psychiatrist, protege of Freud, and then went
yep.
away from Freud and forged his own thing. And an awful lot of what we take for granted in terms of psychological stuff and that's taught in colleges today really comes down to Jung. Do you think that Jung, it's a chance for me to ask you, do you think that Jung's interpretations of dreams are pretty sound, or do you think they're just subjective and but just sort of a useful way into what do you think?
Well, I think we've come a long way. I think he really mapped the unconscious, and in the most profound way that ever had been done prior to him. And that was that you, Rupert, could be over there in Germany right now, and tonight you could dream about, a chalice, a golden chalice. And tonight I can dream about a golden chalice. And there's some kind of collective unconscious material that is ubiquitous. It's throughout the whole world. And he really excavated that dimension of the unconscious, that we're sharing a collective unconscious as well as having our own personal unconscious material. And that was revelatory at the time, that somehow we're linked to these images and these symbols that have pre-existing tremendous meaning that are rooted beyond just myth and story. They live somewhere in the fertile soil of our beings, and it doesn't matter our upbringing, culture, skin color, gender, and none of it. And that's really was his strongest contribution. In terms of individually working, he certainly set up templates, but people have gone much further than that. It's not like everybody who dreams about a snake, it means, oh, you're dealing with your sexuality, or it's the really deeper work is, Rupert, who's that snake to you? You begin to have a dialogue. And he was also most known for what he called, active imagination. So back to your thoughts on imagination, I do think it comes down to that. And so he really encouraged people to engage their dream life in a living, breathing way. It's not just something that happens at night that's past tense, been there, done that. Here's the next day. He was really interested in, like, your snake. And what does that snake want to say to you? Why ask him why he bit you? Don't just interpret that. Ask him.
So when you were doing your dream work and you're working as a therapist with people, you come out of college and you're there it's the 1970s, and the world is
Yep.
opening up and the counterculture is now moving into the mainstream. What what were you saying to people when they were coming to you with their dreams? How were you approaching that? What was your mission with that?
My mission was ultimately, which I now know better now because I still do some of that work. I have actually 2 groups that I work with today. It's gone through lots of cycles, but it's quite active again in my life. But ultimately, what I'm interested in, and the angle in which I work with, is that somehow this notion that day and night are separate,
Mm.
and that this idea, which is not just an idea, it's my felt experience, that you and I right now are in a dream. We're having a podcast dream. And that if you experience night and day as kind of a seamless, and many indigenous people knew this, right? That the things that happen in your outer waking life, so to speak, are a little further away from the felt sense that arrives in what looks irrational in a dream, but it's all the same. It's just that at night we have a different opportunity to generate and create, and to be in a position to actually receive tremendous help, instruction, guidance. I mean, it's just powerful. I'm just continually blown away. I'm
So are
never
you asking people questions that are aimed at helping them to perhaps gain insight into what those dreams are trying to tell them in terms of guidance? Is it primarily that, or is it helping to reassure them that if they're having negative dreams, perhaps, or nightmare dreams, or despair dreams, or something that perhaps isn't necessarily their reality, or when someone comes to you with a dream that they've actually dreamt at night, why are they coming to you with that? And what's your mission is, and I've asked the question before, so it's like I'm repeating myself, but I guess what I'm trying to grasp at is deep down, what are you mostly trying to help them with in this?
Trying to help them expand into being more who they really are.
Okay. Do you feel that that's what dreams are doing, that they're saying to
Ab-
us?
Absolutely. It doesn't matter whether it comes in the form of a nightmare or despair or a snippet. I can't tell you how many people come to a dream because I just have a little snippet and then they start talking about it and a world opens up
Right.
with the little one-liner that they hear or something they see. And I take the position that it's not like you over milk it for meaning. It's inherently meaningful. It's like Jung used to talk about it. Every night, your soul's writing you a letter. And our job is to wake up and open the letter
Now, why do we want to open the letter?
instead of throw it away.
Yeah, I mean, this might sound like a self-evident question, but I think for a lot of people, it really isn't. For a lot of people, a dream is a dream. You dream it, it goes away. Why do we want to open that letter from our soul?
Because you have the most beautiful way of addressing your own being than anybody else. It's your material. It's not, I didn't drop those into your psyche. It's yours. You have the most beautiful way of speaking to yourself. That the other night, 2 nights ago, I dreamt that I went to some being said to me, a wonderful human, just I felt like I really respected this person, said to me, "Go into this room. You're finally ready." And I go into this room and it's like filled floor to ceiling with pearls. I couldn't even barely get the door open. And, okay, that's a letter. Like, what the heck? Right? Now, if I just throw that letter out, I will have missed something quite beautiful for me. And my job as a human is to bow to that, like say thank you, and then engage it. It's not just random
How
flips.
do you unpack that particular dream? Talk me through the process.
Well, for myself, sometimes it's really helpful to have someone else ask you the questions, but I can ask them for myself. I've learned to do that over the years. For myself, I ask very obvious questions like, what did that feel like? Well, I was so kind of intimidated and excited at the same time. What intimidated you, Ginny? Why is that? It's like I was in a room, my mind could say, oh my God, it's pearls of wisdom or it's treasures or that's all true. But I needed to have a direct relationship to feel it. And it was something about feeling the fullness, floor to ceiling fullness of these pearlescent pearls as as a felt experience of, and this person that told me to go in there was basically saying, you're ready now. You're ready. It's kind of arrival time. You're ready. And I'm like both scared and I'm both like excited.
And
Um,
what conclusion did you draw at the end of your analysis of the dream?
I think it affirms something that I've been feeling for a number of years, having turned 70 this year, that this is fulfillment time. It's like to let myself be that full
Okay.
and not be afraid of my own fullness and iridescent possibility to fill myself in with the truth of this being. It's not really about an arrogance or it's just like, wow, fill yourself.
Now, this is interesting to me because we haven't even gone into yet in the podcast the stuff you've actually done in your life, which we're about to. But it would seem to me, knowing you for 20 odd years, a little bit more. Well, Ginny, I mean, it's blindingly obvious. You've just done all this amazing shit and you're going to probably keep doing lots of amazing shit because that seems to be what you do. But why then are you only now being shown that it's time to go into this room of your true power or your true pearls, your true treasures? Given that you've been at it for an awful long time, what do you think is going on with
That's
that?
that's a great question. Well, it's just really pointing to my psychology, isn't it? That I can say, oh, and you can say, oh my God, you've done this and you've done this, but to actually let myself sink into the depth of that and have it hook into the part of me that always cared so much that I have an impact in the world, that my caring could translate. That's something that hasn't fully, it's sort of like I do what I do, sometimes it feels like magic and easy and, but to really feel and really experience the depth of that, let's call it mission fulfilled at this stage in my life when I can see, the sun is going to set here, right? It is, I'm 70. It's like I go, oh my God, that's 10 years from 80. So it's maybe resting in the back wave of the truth of my life and what the pearls I've been able to offer.
I just
And when,
got. Go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt you.
but you be my psychologist, go for it.
Well, I just got an intuitive picture as you were
Yeah,
talking, and the intuitive picture I got is that the person going in to the room is the younger you, and the younger you is really the younger generation, and that the pearls of wisdom, the treasure trove that of experience that you have to offer, that you have amassed through this lifetime, now needs to be opened up
yeah,
to those younger yous that are now coming.
beautiful,
But
beautiful.
that was just, and it's funny, I got a little physical feeling in my
Yep,
solar plexus, and then that image popped in. But
beautiful.
that's Rupert's subjective
Yeah.
interpretation. Yeah,
It
but
gets, it's up to me to have that resonate or not, and it does. I can feel that. And this is the reason why I'm passionate about the dream world is that if I hadn't told you that dream, you wouldn't have engaged me with it. You wouldn't have had your own revelation, intuition about it, which furthers my growth. And that
should we all be having conversations about our dreams?
absolutely,
Why aren't we? Given that we have them every night.
we we've lost that. I mean, there are many, tribes in the world. The Ashwar come to mind in Ecuador that they would never, ever, ever open up a day without having a dream council. Because if we're operating particularly like so you and I are in this moment having this wonderful reconnection and relationship, they're waking up every morning with their families and extended their tribe, so to speak, their village people. And if I know that you dreamt about a snake last night and we're having counsel and you hear about my pearls, part of our relational field commitment, connection, and love field is to mirror that throughout the whole day so that guess what? I mentioned a snake. Well, this morning, actually, I did see my bull snakes finally wake up from their spring hiding. They hide under my bedroom, literally. And there was the bull snake. And I'm carrying you today through your dream of the snake, and you're carrying me. And that was a way of life for many, many tribes. And or you look at, dream cultures in Australia, landscape was the dream. That's what I meant by the seam of night and day starts shifting if you really open up the seams. We keep them separate. We often go to bed at night. Whoa, you just want to crash, right? Just check out and don't want anymore. We're just trying to recover because there's been just a mass amount of content and stimulus, and we just need recovery. But imagine it wasn't like that. Imagine your day life completely speaks to your night life and all the way around. But
It's interesting the messages we get when we're younger. So I remember once trying to recount a dream of mine to my great aunt, who was famously acerbic lady, and
mm,
she was also my way into horses. And so I had this weird, if any of you have ever read Great Expectations, it was a bit like Miss Havisham and Pip, in that Miss Havisham is the sort of mad old, not terribly nice lady, but very interesting lady who lives in the grand old house, and Pip is the boy who's sort of sent to live there. And that was me. She lived in this old decaying house, which had been very grand. There had been money. It had been a bit aristocratic at one point. The money had all been drunk away. And now she lived in the sort of ruins of the house, but there were still old stables with some old retired horses in it. And I found I used to spend every weekend and every holiday with her because I kept the horse that I bought as a teenager with the money that I made from a junk store,
Wow.
her house. And so we had this strange relationship, and she wasn't very nice, but she was definitely the portal into that world for me. And I remember once trying to recount a dream to her, and she turned to me and said in that sort of witheringly sarcastic English way, um, you know, Ribbon, I have to tell you that the truth is there's nothing more boring than having to listen to somebody else's dreams. And in one
Boom.
the guillotine, I sort of never talked about
Yeah.
them again. And I wonder if so behind what you say, we haven't gone on to all the amazing stuff that you've done. So please, listeners, keep listening. But is what you're really saying that in order to thrive, not just survive as a human being, we must live in a spiritual dimension? It's just the other half of who we are. We are the rational half of us and the irrational half of us. And we just slowly sort of spiritually starve to death and just disappear into, misery if we don't live the spiritual life. And the first and most immediate key to that spiritual life is our dreams.
I would say yes. I don't know if it's the first and most immediate. It's not everybody's language. Some
Okay.
people work their whole lives off. They so want to remember dreams, and it's almost impossible for them. And there are lots of tricks I could share. We're not going to do that now, that to help with that. It's a portal for some more than others, and that's just the way it is. And some people would put it down to biochemistry, it doesn't matter. So it is one of the many doors. You can walk through the same door if you've got all your senses open in the forest. It's that content can arrive. Just that can be its own dream, where suddenly you're noticing, right, things because your senses are awake. So it's whatever door that is there to provide an opportunity for us to really wake up.
But yes,
And
I'm playing devil's advocate for the listeners that might say, well, I, I, I don't need, why do I need to do this? Is it about thriving? Is it about actually not being depressed? Is it about being alive on the planet in a way that is more joyful? What's in it for us to engage with our dreams or engage spiritually in this way?
I think it's simple. If you want to have a meaningful life, a life that really translates to you, and your meaning base is going to be different than mine. But
Mm.
if you really want to have a meaningful life, if you don't want to just go through the motions of life, sort of half awake or sleepwalking, or, wondering there's something unfulfilled, something that's not happening, low grade depression, however it manifests. This is one of the more extraordinary ways to open up that deep felt experience. There's something meaningful going on here. There's something larger than just this little being sitting over here and that being over there that is moving through this existence. And there are a million names for that thing. It's some would call that God, some would call it great spirit, some would call it mother, father, divine, and some would call it the Tao, doesn't matter. It's the thing that seeds life with the richness and the texture of this very precious existence that is so brief but so potent.
Beautifully put. Okay, so when I met you, you had been obviously doing this type of therapy work for a long time. You'd also gone through marriage and parenthood. You had had children. Those children, when I first met you, were already grown. And when I first met you, you were already a mover and shaker in education, in climate change, before anyone was even talking about it. And then went on to put out some extremely sort of policy changing bits of media that have resonated, through the decades and got things actually done. And then I also knew you as you were starting this thing called Bead for Life, with women in Africa doing microfinance. How did you, which has grown into something huge, which I hope you'll tell us about. How did you go from, okay, well, I'm a therapist. There's lots of therapists out there. And yes, I'm doing good in the world, but I'm a therapist and I'm a mum. Okay, great. I'm putting nice human beings into the world. And I've met your children. At least I've met two of them and they're great human beings. So job done. How do you suddenly go from that to the kind of world stage that you've been operating on since I've known you? What happened?
Well, I got very sick.
Okay.
I was 35 and after my third child was born, I just really had a hard time recovering and I knew something was wrong. And talk about dreams. I had some pretty prophetic dreams that something was not right. And long story short, I was diagnosed with breast cancer and a very aggressive form. So
At 35.
at 35,
And
did
your
not
kids,
look,
how old at that time?
they were 8, 6, and 2.
Shit. Okay.
That I really remember. And, as anybody knows, when you go through a diagnosis or extreme health crisis, your life flips upside down and you're very quickly measuring everything. And it all becomes about measurement, everything from how much time might I have left to what really matters, what's the priority, how do I measure those things? So it was a deep time of doing inventory, taking a look at what internal resources I had to meet this challenge. And long story short, it was a dramatic few years of, surgeries and chemotherapy but I couldn't return to the sort of classic therapy world that I was in. First world problems took on a different proportion. I couldn't sit there in the room when somebody was just furious at their husband and he didn't like the tiles she chose for the bathroom, whatever. I just was like, I can't do this. And I wanted to get on the ground where there was a different relationship to suffering and people that daily lives, they're in survival in many third world countries. And I just had a deep call and knowing that I needed that. And so, as serendipity would have it, a good friend of mine who's an AIDS doctor was going to Uganda. And I asked if I could come. My daughters were very interested in the HIV issue at the time. And I thought, let's take them there and give them a real experience. And we went going through refugee camps after refugee camps and, looking at extreme suffering. And there was this extraordinary group of women that were making beads out of paper. And like they were gorgeous, hard to imagine. But take a piece of paper from a magazine, cut out a triangle, make a bead and make a necklace. And they had piles of them, necklaces and bracelets and earrings, but they had hundreds of women, but they had no way to market them. And suddenly it was my friend and I that were there together. We saw it. It's like, oh, we took the beads home after being over there for, a month or 6 weeks. And as again, synchronistic moment where a friend heard about it and sent them to Oprah. And then suddenly we're in Oprah's magazine, 400 words in the O magazine. And suddenly we had a real problem, which was a huge demand. And we had to even put together an organization. We were just sort of clueless how to do that part. And that was a whole learning curve. Our commitment was to find a way to sell this quote product. But basically, our interest was never actually, it was not microloaning. We were kind of opposed to that. It was much more how how do you create the pathway for a woman who makes $2 a day pounding road base in the hot sun to $10 a day where she can afford school fees for her children and medicine and for her children and food. And this was an income generating project. And, hundreds, thousands and thousands of volunteers eventually around the world participated in selling these beads and hosting like a Tupperware party model where you sell the beads and tell the story of these amazing women. And then it morphed over time, years. This was a good 17 years of my life. It morphed into what's now called the Street Business School, which is a really incredible on the ground grassroots curriculum a teaching curriculum of how a woman can go from extreme poverty to being a true entrepreneur and having many businesses. So that's where it's landed. So we started in Uganda, and now we're in 40 some other countries, and it's got a life of its own.
Why were you opposed to microloaning, and are you still opposed to it?
Well, those, go back to the days when, that was really kind of just beginning, and the interest payments themselves often became a very tricky thing.
Okay.
And there were some organizations that, really looked like they were in service to loaning, but actually would start raising the interest rates if you couldn't pay it back,
Right.
within the first year. And we kind of, our motto was, it was like a leg up and not a handout. Not a handout in any way, because what these women, we discovered, I'm making big generalizations, but it was our felt experience consistently. I mean, they had desire, every desire to work. They just needed, right, the support and context which we could create
So
with them.
you in the early stages, and that's a collective you, were buying these beautiful beads, and I've seen the beads. They are extraordinary. You'd never know they were made out of what they're made,
Paper.
and let alone magazine paper. They look stunning. You were initially just from your own pocket, just buying them, and then thinking, oh my gosh, how do we sell these things? And brainstorming with each other and coming up with eventually the idea of the sort of Tupperware thing. How, how did you do it?
Well, some of it was, the minute you work in another culture, you got to be humble because you don't really know what you're doing. You really don't. And to assume that we, as sort of my partner and I, two white women, really had a handle on, how things worked in Africa. I mean, within the first months, we're encountering all kinds of corruption and things that were so shocking and upsetting to us. And it was like, well, wait a minute here. This is a way of life. How do you work with that? What are our values? How do we inject that without asserting that as a way to grow an organization? So it was a huge learning curve. We made mistakes. We did amazingly exciting things. We partnered with all kinds of British Airlines would fly all their used magazines and give them to us. And, Habitat for Humanity, we had a partnership with them, and we bought a piece of land. We were made a serious profit in our early years when we were just simply a profit-making organization. And, what do we do with this extra money? We can't just sort of park it. So we bought land, and then the women built their own village. We got partnerships, so there was sweat in the game. So we had some core principles that we really believed in, but the course of that, river, so to speak, just took us down some wild rapids of just rapid learning and mistakes, and we would regroup, and we were smart enough to know what we didn't know. And that probably was why we were successful.
Now,
It
you talk about though you got on Oprah magazine, and you partner with British Airways, you partner with Habitat for Humanity. Well, look, I run nonprofits, and I know how difficult it is to get through those particular types of doors. How
yeah.
did you do it?
We were smart enough to hire at a certain point a full-time social media, marketing person. So we got on every major TV, Good Morning America. We would go to New York, and, you know, and at the time, Rupert, it was the story to be told. Now, fair trade products connected to, you know, communities, is pretty much out there, and I don't think we would do nearly so well now. We were right at the beginning 17 years ago of, wow, look at this product. Now it's less about selling you a product, but I'm going to tell you the story of these women. And they carried story. And then the women that would host the parties to sell them would take that story as though it was theirs as well. And then that became a way in which story could move through a product. Yes, they're beautiful and lovely. Where it started getting painful and difficult is when we had to keep kind of coming up with the next cool marketing thing that was not in our hearts, like, oh, now we got the Mother's Day products, and that was never a product product first organization. That was a means to a larger end, which was to tell the story and for these women to find ways to elevate themselves with pride and dignity and dollars in the bank. So how we did it was, really deep, deep listening to sort of the right course and the one that was already kind of in our face that we just had to recognize that was part of the work. It's like, oh, these women. And when you really looked at what they were about, there was zero issue with motivation. We didn't even need to go into that door whatsoever. Big issue around dignity and confidence. So then we had to map what's the landscape of confidence? How do you build confidence when you're told your whole life you're poor and you need $100 to even think about starting a business? We had to dispel that mythos and say, no,
How did you dispel that?
the first modular of the curriculum as we talk about assets, and first of all, you're the most important asset, you the woman. And then, well, what do you have in your hut? Oh, I've got an iron in the corner I haven't used in years. Okay, that's an asset. Really grassroots, that's an asset. Oh, you've got, cassava growing in the plot next door. There's your next asset. So kind of dispelling the myth that you suddenly have to have $100, you got to go out and borrow it. No, you grow that asset. And then, we put them in groups with each other or they're coaches for each other. So, I'm Coach Ginny and I'm saying to Coach Evelyn, you can do that. And we're mapping confidence and a deep sense of this is possible, because that's not rooted deeply in a very poor culture like where we were working. It's just simply not.
Right. But you can't just cheerlead people, right? So for example, if you say,
No,
okay, you've got this iron or you've got this cassava that's growing, these are your assets. How do you
teach them.
show somebody who doesn't know how to use that as an asset, how to? What are the nuts and bolts of that?
Well, we would go with them to market,
Okay.
sell, go together and sell the goods. And then, one of the modulars of the curriculum is they're each given, the equivalent of $20. And then they get to observe how they spent the money toward the business that they finally decided. And it's a process to look at what your talent is and what your assets are so that you're going to be successful. So if you think you've got some talent sewing, okay, how the hell are you going to get a sewing machine? How is that going to be doable? And we'd walk them through, right, the pathway to be able to do that. And so they would at a certain point get $20. Then they come back and reflect on, ooh, I think I made a mistake because I gave, half of it to my uncle to build me a vegetable stall. And he just flaked off with it. Oops. Right. So just learning on the ground. I mean, really we're talking really grassroots learning and being completely accompanied in the learning process so that, they're assured that they're actually going to be successful. And, we've had, I can't remember the name of the Wharton Business School. They did a huge analysis of our organization. And, we spent a lot of time doing really grounded data analysis. So it's not just narratives. I'm not just telling you lovely stories. And we had 85% success rate of women permanently getting out of poverty.
Here's a question. So one would expect, let's say there's an entrepreneur out there and that entrepreneur feels a sense of mission and goes and helps poorer people become entrepreneurs. You had come out of counterculture, radical feminism, radical everything, become a therapist, become a mother. Now suddenly you're an entrepreneur coaching entrepreneurs. From what background and how?
I would say little background,
Yeah.
very little background, but definitely enough of the right attitude. And as I said, illness set me on a very particular course.
What made you able, as someone who hadn't engaged as an entrepreneur? I mean, of course, everyone who runs their own business, you've been running a successful therapy business at that point. So, of course, you were an entrepreneur to that degree, but what we think of in terms of the cliche of an entrepreneur,
Right.
what made you feel that you had the tools for this? Why didn't you feel that you were the one needing, with that myth of I need the $100. You know what I mean?
Right.
What,
Right.
where
Yeah.
did you get those tools from? And where did you get the practical business tools from, of showing them how to create assets when you had actually come from rather a different world?
Well, we knew, which women tend to know, is that it's a collaboration and that it's not a hierarchy,
Mm.
and that, we really were smart enough to know where our talent was and where it wasn't, and we got the right talent. We had a business manager that, really taught us in many ways. My partner was also a therapist. So, I mean, we used to laugh, say, well, we're kind of the bozos here, like, but what we brought to the table was the vision, was the capacity, right, to stay with it. We knew we had that drive. We also understood what fundamentally women need, the language of the feminine. Like these women, when you've really listened and watched, they're constantly dancing and constantly singing, even through their suffering, even through their wailing, having just lost a child, to dehydration. It's like, shocking for us to like, how are you managing that level of grief? They do it together, and observing that and understanding like how, I can't tell you how many parties we hosted, how many dances. It was like, oh, we brought so much celebrate. They taught us so much about that, right? And we kind of could, as women, we could feel what it is that women are about. And we are a collective, and we do have that. I mean, I'm saying men don't, but we've got a different kind of wider capacity. And easy for me to say, with no shame whatsoever, we are bozos. We do not know how to do this, but boy, do we know some amazing people who do. And then what happened, which was part of the magic part of it, was the right people show up at the right time when you're clear. It's almost like a law of gravity. Suddenly, there they are at the door and said, I'm going to help you with this. I'm going to help you with this.
Were you consciously saying, like, I remember I had this moment with my son when I was sort of standing in a field, not knowing what to do when he was at the height of his severity, and I was realizing, I need a mentor. I need, who is it who can show me what to do? Because I don't know. And then I was thinking,
Yeah,
okay, well, who would this mentor be? And my imagination, well, it has to be someone who's autistic, right? Because otherwise, whatever they've got is an opinion, not
right.
experience. And then, they had to started where my son started and somehow made it. Who's that person? And I went, oh, actually, that's Dr. Temple Grandin. And then I went to her and asked for mentorship. Was it kind of like that? Were you going, okay,
Absolutely.
shit, who are be our mentors here, and how do we actively go out to find them?
Absolutely. That's exactly it. Yep. And, it requires a willingness to be kind of humble enough to know, whoa, we really don't. We don't know how to do that. The woman that helped us develop this, I mean, rock solid curriculum, which we finally figured out after years that that was our real talent, is we knew the ingredients, right? It wasn't about selling beads. It was actually the ingredients. As I said, one of the key ingredients is building that landscape of confidence, which seems sort of abstract and somewhat irrelevant. It isn't. That's the key. And we knew that. We saw that over and over again. And she had this amazing way of breaking this whole thing down into a sequenced curriculum that built on itself, that embedded in it were all these principles, and then the real practicalities involved in actually creating businesses that are sustainable.
Who was this mentor?
A woman that we found, and I don't know what more to say about her. She probably wouldn't want to be named because
Okay.
she's
Someone,
very
yeah, because everyone will be, contacting
well,
her.
maybe, but she's extraordinary, and emerged as an amazing leader and willingness to fly to country to country to country. We
Was
were
it
raised
someone you already knew, or was it someone that you sought out who kind of popped into your path once you'd sort of thrown out to the universe? Come on, God, where's my mentor?
yes, yeah. We didn't know her. We knew people who might know people, but again, it's just that process that we all go through and are ready to really reach out. And but you gotta shoot that arrow with utter clarity. I learned that years and years, years of working, different different forms of manifestation. That the clarity is key. It's not that you have to have everything, but what are you really shooting for? We
Clarity
were
and the
we were
emotion.
really yeah, we were really shooting for a big goal, big hairy goal, which was, in a 10-year period of time, a million women permanently out of poverty. And, we had very particular parameters to what that meant. But
And that happened.
yes,
Amazing.
yeah, yeah,
By the way, I say readers because I'm an author. Listeners, don't worry if you're trying to manifest and you're feeling murky and unclear and
sure.
you're shooting unclear arrows. You've got to do that too. Um,
Absolutely.
you've got to
And
shoot
you got to
unclear
knife at the
before they
target.
become right.
You got to fail. We failed a lot. There are some big mistakes we made that look back, I'm just kind of horrified. But, boy, did it get us on the right course. You just course correct if you're determined, which we were.
Two other things that you did, which I can speak to, is right at the time that you were doing this, the work that I was doing with the Bushmen in the Kalahari, the Khoisan Bushmen, on their land claims rights
Yeah.
came along. And you acted as a philanthropist to us. You helped us to get going. And listeners, what happened was, as a result of that early support, two key hunter-gatherer groups in Southern Africa collectively won the 5 largest land claims in African history with very little money against seemingly impossible odds. So that was my experience also of your influence. And then also shortly after that, I began the work with Horseboy Foundation, and you supported that too, while also going through all the stuff with Bead for Life, and then moving into this other very important work with climate change. And I remember you beginning to talk to me about climate change when people weren't. I mean, it's not that it wasn't around at all, but we all know that the conversation has really only become properly mainstream, I think, since COVID. I think that pre that, it was still more or less on the margins. And the times that when you were talking about it and getting really actively involved, I think most people were still trying to turn a blind eye. And you've been very influential in helping them see
Yeah.
a glaring light of all the pimples and warts, etc., through a series of extraordinary films that have had an amazing influence on also getting policy changes and things like that. Can you tell us about Chasing Ice and Chasing Coral, how you got involved in those movies, what those movies were, still are, they're out there, people should watch them, and what they did?
Yeah, well, I'll begin with Chasing Ice because that was really my initiation. Have the good fortune of Jim Baylog, who the film is about, who's a National Geographic, post-National Geographic photographer, who's really spent most of his career documenting, we'll call it change, and then species change, extinction, and climate became more and more his passion, and particularly climate as is being observed on glaciers. So being a good friend and being pretty intrigued, and I did some supporting of his organization called Extreme Ice Survey. What he did is he designed and built cameras that could withstand cold temperatures and high winds on glaciers, and it would operate time lapse, so they would be basically running themselves. And he put these all over the glaciers, Iceland and Greenland, and eventually parts of America and Switzerland, all over the world, and Antarctica eventually, to try to document in real time climate change and these time lapse images that are astounding. If people haven't seen the film, it's so worth watching. It's an old story now in many ways, but it was the first it was like eyeballs on the glacier, eyeballs on climate change. It was not political. Nothing about it was political. It's like, take a look. Here it is. It's in your face now. And what you see rapidly in a time lapse, you'll see a whole sequence of frames where the glacier was kind of, right in front in front and all of a sudden it's receded what looks, like equivalent of a mile in a X number of year period. And it's like, you can't argue with that. So it was a brilliant and very determined mission that he had. I loved it. I went to Greenland. I was in those helicopters flying over the glacier. And, that was whatever it was, 15 some years ago. And I had that privilege, and it was a privilege. It was massively depressing. I came home and practically couldn't get out of bed for 3 weeks because I saw the level of glacial melt from that perspective. And it was just very easy for me to translate that to sea rise. It just was just simple equation. And it was shocking. And so that really launched my commitment to trying to tell the story of climate change and trying to kind of wake us up. Al Gore certainly did that. And Inconvenient Truth is just, those first beginning, let's tell the truth, what's really happening. Chasing the other films came along because I love film. I think next life I might go into movies. We'll see. It's like I love to edit. I love being behind a camera and looking at how to tell the story and how to tell it in the best possible way. So that was part of my just selfish passions, like get me in the room when we're especially editing film to sort of see what I could bring to it. And again, films are a huge number of people, it's a whole team, but that's been a real privilege for me to work on these films. And then they morphed into, I've got very close to the director of Chasing Ice, a young, amazing man, Jeff Orlovsky, and Exposure Labs. And we worked on a film probably many of your listeners have watched, which is called The Social Dilemma, trying to tell that story of.
Before we get to the social dilemma,
Okay.
coral. Tell us about chasing coral.
Obviously the same story from now not on top of a mountain, but down under the ocean, and really looking at the story of climate change and the warming of the oceans through coral. And that was actually not a good film until we worked our asses off to figure out how to help everyone fall in love with coral and understand, it's not just a concept. These are bleaching and dying, these reefs all over the world. But like, why do you want to love this coral? How critical it is to our ecosystem. So that was a very passionate film. And we found a wonderful young kid who was kind of a geek about oceans since he was a kid. And he kind of ended up being the savior of that film because that was a hard story to tell, to engage people in a way that had a sense of adventure. Like Chasing Ice has a great sense of adventure in it. And I think we're successful with it. The films have done really well.
So
And
the
much
films.
so much so
Go ahead.
they all ended up in Congress. We found a great way to get them to be shown with, they have a film series for Congress, and all of Congress, they all got copies. And, that was a long time ago. And, that was a huge awakening at a political level.
Did you see some
Anthony
tangible
Apollo's
results
done
politically?
that.
Did you see some tangible results politically from those things, from those films, that things happened?
Yes and no. I don't think anybody should make a film these days without having a really developed impact strategy because films come and go so quickly. So, what's your impact strategy? How are you going to actually move it out into the world in what way? And with Chasing Ice and Coral, we decided to go to some of these districts, deep Republican districts that didn't even believe in climate change. And we came up with a strategy that we would just saturate those communities, from the Chamber of Commerce to the kids in the high schools that would go home and tell their parents this movie they saw. We just soaked them. And we did get some of those districts to actually change their position on climate, but it was a very arduous and expensive strategy. And so, yes, we certainly had impact, and it's very hard to measure the impact of films. There's all these studies on like how many inputs you need to actually take an action, and it's often a minimum of 6. So you got to read about it, you got to see it, you've got to talk to a friend about it, you got to have a parent, talk to the kid about, that you need inputs in order to actually get from that's interesting, okay, well, I'm back to my day, to actually, contributing in some way. It's complicated.
Right, but you did get to Congress.
They
And
did.
I do know myself how powerful that can be. I remember when we got in front of the Congressional Human Rights Caucus with the Bushmen, and suddenly you had these guys speaking directly to congressmen, and they could see these people who'd been
Yeah.
tortured, kicked off their land for diamonds, in front of them. And then things began to happen from
Yep.
that point. So now tell us about The Social Dilemma. That was a really, really interesting film and remains a really, really interesting film because I think all these films are still relevant today, but I think this one is particularly relevant to the youngest generation that's coming up. Tell us about that film.
Um, in terms of how it was conceived or,
A lot.
uh, well, I think, again, the same director, he talked to me about it. He was working on it and what was the right angle. And, we kind of came up with this idea, we being many again, and not just a few of us, that a good way to kind of break through the resistance would be to actually have the guy that invented the like button on Facebook in front of a camera saying, whoops, I didn't have any idea of, I thought that was a cute idea. I had no idea that that could translate to, preteen girls' suicide rate going through the ceiling because, they got, unliked by, all their friends, and that drove them to suicide. And that trajectory was so shocking and is shocking, remains shocking. But, that was the strategy with that film, is have the people that were somewhat innocently, I mean, not all, participating in something that has snowballed into something that is really seriously out of control. And I think again, I'm not so sure that film would be as relevant in this moment because people know a lot more now, but it was the real expose about how young people in particular are being manipulated financially and how they're actually gathering your data. And that was, not in everybody's awareness. Like, oh, they actually know from the way I shop and the way I communicate they know if I'm an introvert or if I'm an extrovert. Oh, they know if I'll buy this, but I won't buy that. Oh, they know, I mean, and whoa, and that sense of exposure and vulnerability of how much, AI knows about you. And so that was a great way to tell that story. And we worked hard to try to figure out how to do it. It's kind of a hybrid film because there's a theatrical piece within a documentary. Hybrid model was new. Not all films have tried that, and it was relatively successful because it was real time. You see a family really struggling with the issues, and then you're listening to, the guy that ran Facebook, or Tristan, who was kind of amazing leader in the field of social media exposure and what is the harm it's causing.
The guy who invented the like button. Um,
Trying to remember his name.
I'm trying to, yeah. And it's so interesting is that we know the like button, but we can't remember the name of the guy who.
Yeah,
I remember watching the movie and seeing him being interviewed and saying, yeah, look, we did just think that this might be something kind of entertaining. We had no idea. We had no idea at all that it would become so dark.
yeah,
And initially we were just obviously excited by the success, but we didn't think it would be anything other than
yeah,
a sort of entrepreneurial fad. And
yeah,
I think also that a lot of these guys were just so into the technology. They were nerds who were just so excited that their day had come, that it was the revenge of the nerds, Silicon Valley. It was suddenly
yeah,
all the kids that were getting, who'd been teased at school, who had been the butt end of the social scenes in their high schools, who would have been the ones actually probably going off and getting depressed and perhaps killing themselves, before social media, just through straight up bullying and ostracism. Now suddenly they were the arbiters,
yeah,
but they didn't do it with this Machiavellian plan to get even. They just were following the brilliance of their technology and
yeah,
realizing people liked it. And then,
yeah,
oops, we didn't realize we'd invented the atomic bomb. And I think that's what really came through from the movie when I watched it, was that, like with Oppenheimer, for example, they knew absolutely what they were trying to develop and why they were trying to develop. And they
yeah,
knew exactly what its evil potential was,
right,
and felt that they had to stop this greater evil,
yeah,
not knowing that it could lead to greater evils, but not seeing any alternative at the time, and so on. Whereas that wasn't in any way where these guys were coming from. They thought they were simply providing entertainment and couldn't have dreamt that it would lead to the
Yeah. Well, it was more, essentially more than entertainment because, they were as confused as we've all become around this notion of connectivity.
Ah, yes.
And so not really having a measure at the time, and we have a better measurement now of the illusion of connectivity and this whole notion of hyperconnectivity as a high value and how that's actually deeply, deeply tearing cultural fabric out from underneath us. And that's the part that, was short-sighted. They couldn't see that. We think we're getting you more connected and actually something else is occurring as well. That's true at one level, and another level, it's actually taking away your capacity to connect.
Right.
So, how many young people now know how to exactly like build a conversation like you and I are having? How many people are really going to listen to this whole long podcast? Right? We kind of
Yeah.
want it kind of quick. We want it in a hyper way. And, they couldn't have seen that. They didn't see that. To your point, they thought it was kind of fun and lovely and you're going to feel more connected because someone's going to like you when you do something. And that's so cool. No, it's embedded in a much deeper, deeper, very more transparent problem now of where our culture is headed.
I mean, it's interesting because a lot of the work I do could not have existed, could not have found its feet without social media. But that was before I even knew it was active. For example, when we first put out the small trailer, when we were trying to raise funds to make the documentary for the Horseboy, there was this new thing called YouTube. This is 2006. I think YouTube came out in 2005. And the young filmmaker, Michael Scott, who I teamed up with to make the Horseboy, said, oh, there's this thing. We could do a little thing and put it out on there. And maybe, who knows, maybe some people might come and help. It was one of the first things that went viral back in the day when going viral didn't mean what it means today, but nonetheless it did. And because of that, all this work that we now do with autism happened. So that was a result of one aspect of social media. Or here we are, we're talking on Zoom right now. That is, of course, another one. But I think where you're right is that we come out of this analog generation where we learned to communicate before social media came along.
Yeah.
And then it was added as a sort of a tool that we
Right.
sometimes like to engage with and sometimes don't like to engage with, rather than growing up with it as the tool.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah. Well said. Well said. And so, we have to pray for these young people that that's all they've known. This is all they've known. And, how are we going to serve them in remembering that discernment that you just named, which is that it's an amazing tool. That's all it is.
yeah.
It's a tool. It's a tool. But does it replace your actual social, right, interactive felt experience? No, it can't. And we've now finally discovered that. Right?
And your film was one of the first ones that alerted people to it.
Yeah. No, it was obviously the right note in the right moment. I think 20 million people saw it in the first 3 weeks. That was a huge,
probably thanks to social media.
all thanks to social media. You got it. And I'll never forget talking. I had many, many conversations with young people around the world, and they all were saying the same things. Like, they're not going to throw out, the ending of it's kind of trite. It's like, well, just get off it. Well, if you grew up with it and you love it and parts of it are wonderful, like, how are you going to do that? But every single one, whether it was a young person in India or where they were in Pakistan, wherever they were in South America, they all said the same thing. We've got to come up with better platforms.
Yeah.
And I thought, okay, good challenge for you. Let's pass that baton to you. See if you can figure that out. First of all, where they're not getting hold of your data.
Yeah.
You're not being marketed, in a completely manipulative way. But secondly, how do you actually generate a tool that actually can supply the connection like you and I are having right now?
Yeah.
And we're saving a whole lot of carbon to do this. We're not getting on airplanes. All that has its rightful place, but they're going to have to figure this out because they're not going to throw out. Why would you?
I almost wonder if we're going to have to sort of reopen the sort of old schools of philosophy, but within schools of this is
Mhm.
how this is how a human being talks to another human being.
Uh,
Uh,
I've always wanted, I actually developed, like, it's I'd probably be horrified if I looked at it now, but many years ago, I went on a retreat in Greece and I wrote a curriculum for high school kids called The Art of Communication. And I thought, like, how do you break down conversation? What's the art of sorry, it was the art of conversation, not communication. How do you actually have conversation? What does that mean
and why do
exactly?
you need? Yeah,
And why do you need it? And what does it feel like when, you and I get off the podcast and we grew something bigger than we knew we could? And that generates a feeling not just of exhaustion or depletion, like we've all had those conversations, but it should lots of those. It should be additive, right?
yeah,
Lots
yeah.
of
It should
something,
be. It should.
you're growing something bigger than these two parts could know. And that's the glory opportunity of real conversation. But,
Right.
how do you tell a young person who just wants you to get through it in 3 seconds, please, and let's get to the bottom data point or whatever? It's sort of a lost art.
Yes, you can't manifest without
Right.
conversation, conversation between people, conversation between people and the divine. But I think also there's just a straight up nurturing of the individual human in that we are, they call us sapiens sapiens, right? But that's a
Yep.
silly name for us, Homo sapiens. It just means the thinking ape. All apes think. In fact, anything with a brain thinks. You know,
Yep.
octopuses have 8 brains. You know, I mean, that's not specific to our species. But
Yep.
this voice box, this larynx that I've got, that you've got, with a speaking ape, with a storytelling ape, that is other animals vocalize, and many of them vocalize in a very complex way, but they don't create rap and they don't write Shakespeare. That's us. That's our species. And the sort of shamanic thing, story is medicine, story is so
Yep.
that is
And
conversation. And without that,
that's
how do we, yeah,
back to imagination. I mean, that was what William Blake meant when all of his work was kind of in service to what he called divine imagination, is the divine gift of this species, right? Is that we can vocalize, but we can imagine with it, and off we go. Insane creativity is possible. So, and there's a lot of creativity that happens on devices. My God.
it is.
So yeah, like, but so then really beginning to understand, analyze, like actually what might be missing. Like what are you actually having an experience of? Like that when you walk away and it's like, right? So it's not an easy answer. It's definitely an important
No,
inquiry.
it's really interesting when we're doing our work, movement method, horseboy method, we're obviously going into nature as much as we can because that's what the human nervous system needs.
Yeah.
People frequently, parents or teachers will say, well, to the child that we're taking, oh, you can't bring your device because this is your nature time or this is your horse time. I'm like, no, 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 no. Absolutely, they can bring their device. Please bring your safety blanket
Yeah. Yeah.
and please, and now engage with that in nature. And what will happen is pretty soon you'll get a bit distracted by nature and
Yeah.
you'll start forgetting to use that device. And we're not trying to wean you from your device. In fact, we think your use of this device is a good thing. However, if you don't also have what your organism needs, well, then no, you won't thrive. But yes, we
Yeah.
absolutely accept that we live in the age of devices and they're not all bad by any means. So please engage with it. And it's funny how extreme and black and white, I guess, that's so endemic to our culture. But
Yeah.
these
That's
extreme, uh,
that's brilliant. That's a brilliant way to talk about it, Rue. I love that. This is brilliant. It's like, no, bring it with you. And then you let this, there is a natural impulse, whether nature's pulling that out of us or whether another human is. There is a natural impulse to have this connection that grows. It's natural. This is not like all mysterious.
it's very
Oh,
interesting. By the time we say light a fire at night, none of them are on their devices. We don't even have to try. But
love it.
their device might be lying next to them, but they're not on it. Yeah. But then
Well,
when they get back on it, maybe they're getting back on it and engaging in a different type of conversation. Oh,
Yeah, I love it. No, and it's spot on. And like, how often are you and I checking our phones while we're talking right now? It's
A
like
zillion times.
a zillion times. Yeah, right. So not needed. But again, it's not like there's a rule, it's just
Well, and the phone has set me free because the fact that I can WhatsApp you in Boulder, Colorado from here in Germany, and the fact that someone else can WhatsApp me while I'm talking to you, that sets us free because yes, we can live in parallel realities, which we
yeah,
always have anyway, but we can do those through our devices. We can have our livelihoods through our
yeah,
devices and we can be creative through our devices. But
yeah.
I think only if we also keep one of our feet firmly in nature will it help us thrive and not just
Well,
pain.
yeah, I feel completely with you on that note. Not everybody feels that way, but part
Indeed.
of it comes down to presence. Like how present, like back to Ram Dass, be here now. How present? What's our capacity to actually be present?
And I think it's more complex than it's often presented. So, for example, you've had this experience when you've been in the company of a really senior shaman.
Yep.
Like I'm thinking about, say, Ghost from the reindeer people in Mongolia who healed my son, or Besa, who was the healer in the Kalahari that I was the closest to. They would go in and out of trance parallel to being in the quote unquote real world. Whereas the
Mhm.
younger healers, they were either in trance or they were not. And then they would reach this point when they were in the 60s or 70s, where they could simultaneously walk the
Yep.
two paths and literally be kind of like smoking a cigarette and having a conversation with someone about something very banal while falling in and out of trance and sort of pulling something out of somebody's spine. And is that not what we're doing when we're on our devices
Yep.
while talking to each other? If the intention is with what you do with that device while you're talking to somebody to bring healing in some way, or that is that not the same process really in a funnier way?
No, I think that's spot on. That's pretty much what I was trying to say. That ultimately, what happens in our nightlife, besides just crashing and like just wanting to check out, it's kind of another fertile realm of existence. They can all be singing to each other, and it all can happen simultaneously. I mean, now we're getting kind of out there, but I absolutely know it's possible. The Tibetans have researched that for thousands of years. They call it dream yoga, where you actually can wake up fully. It's beyond even lucid dreaming. You can wake up fully inside. I mean, it's death practice ultimately,
Mm.
because you're waking up fully inside of your night experience and you're wide awake, but you're asleep. And like, how do you do this simultaneously, like you just said, where it's not it's not a question of, oh, I'm not present or I have to be here or here. It's this black and white thing that we have gotten ourselves into. It has a weaving. We just don't know how to live it.
You've mentioned at the beginning, while we were chatting before this began, about another project called Chasing Time. What's that about?
Well, that's really the literal finale of taking these cameras down all over the world. And the last
The
camera,
cameras, the time lapse climate change.
time-lapse cameras that were part of Chasing Ice. So Chasing Time is really a much shorter version. It's maybe a 45-minute film piece on Jim Baylog, the photographer, going back to take down the very last camera, which happens to be in Iceland. And so it's full of incredible images. I mean, gorgeous portraits of glaciers that just make you fall in love, in part knowing that we're not going to see those images in X number of years. There's going to be no glacier left, no snow left to be looking at. And it's also the story. So it's visually gorgeous and kind of a love affair. And it's also the story of taking down the last camera and handing it over to, in this case, the government got involved in this project and decided they wanted to launch a more citizen science project as the tail of this project into the future, which would be people, citizens going to these same spots where Jim took it's a very specific spot. You don't change your spot if you're going to do time lapse. It's got to be exact. So the exact same spot, with these brass kind of stands where have a little mount on them where you can mount your iPhone. And you, me, just regular citizens can take a picture and that picture will go into a database of images. And so their child, 20 years from now can take the same picture in the same spot and be comparing to how much retreat there's been. And the angle for Icelandic people is they love their glaciers. They love them. It's a big part of their culture. It's also a huge part of tourism, the amount of diversity in that. If you've ever been to Iceland, it's so diverse. It's kind of astounding. And so, in the film, you see, hundreds and hundreds of people that live in Iceland engaged in this project from their love of the glaciers and their love of wanting to document their loss. So it's kind of an active science project, but it's also a grieving project and a way of engaging their grief that these things are going. And one day, their children are not going to see any of the landscape they have, which is so impressive. So what a beautiful thing to go from an individual. It's not about Jim Baylog anymore. It's about the people participating and documenting the change in the world. And that's real time, real life engaging. And these projects are actually, as you probably know, these citizen scientist projects are sprouting up all over the world where people are engaged in observing that, oh my God, that species of birds didn't come back this year. And they have a way to send that data in and participate in telling the story of this changing planet. So it's a brilliant way to end this extraordinary effort that Jim made.
I want to bring the conversation we're going to sort of head for the home stretch now.
Good.
But um, by the way, listeners tend to break these things up into segments to listen to, but you've got so much that, okay. So before I just go to the last set of things I wanted to ask you about, you got Chasing Time, which you're working on. What have you got another movie up your sleeve?
Well, yeah, there's a wonderful book called Braiding Sweetgrass, which is
Uh,
if your listeners haven't read, I highly recommend that. Have you read it?
I can highly recommend it to Braiding Sweetgrass. I was given it by a Cheyenne Native American woman
Whoa, wow.
who was actually braiding in Yellowstone National Park, who braided sweetgrass for my daughter Freya and braided it into
Wow.
her hair, and for my younger son Kirian. And she said, "You guys must read this book," and we did. And so we read it aloud to our children. For those last year, for those who don't know what braiding sweetgrass is, please, Ginny, tell us.
Well, it's the woman who wrote is called Robin Wall Kimmer. Is she a botanist? I'm trying to remember her actually. I mean, she's got, very strong, serious science background, but indigenous. And it's a really hard book to describe how she's engaging us in the ingredients of, I'm going to put this in air quotes, an indigenous way of living, where we're in right relationship to all species and all beings. And she's a masterful storyteller. So she'll tell you the whole story of sweetgrass, and it's, before you know it, you're smelling it, and then you really kind of want to plant it. And I've learned how to make sweetgrass baskets.
For those
So
listeners who are, say, driving a car in Berkshire in England right now, listening to this, what is sweetgrass?
it's just, kind of one of gazillion thousands of grasses, but it's been used traditionally in native cultures for, basket making, also for smudging. They often weave it into braids where you can, light it, and it creates it's an amazing scent. It's sweetness of grass. If you could just imagine putting your face in really fresh grass, it's so, so sweet. But it's not, we would not look at it and go, that's an amazingly special grass. It kind of grows in kind of not so great conditions. It sort of doesn't matter, but she elevates it to its rightful place. And what she's trying to say throughout the whole book is all these species are beings. They're living beings that have this dynamic expression, in this case, in the form of plants that are full of all kinds of medicines for us. And we simply have not learned how to actually have a direct experience with these beings. We might use them, we might be interested, but like actually, she really takes us through the experience of what it is to actually listen to a plant and have the plant speak.
That's the, I think for many people, the revelatory part of, if you like, modern day spirituality, is that suddenly there's an acceptance, thanks to you guys from the counterculture. 50 years on, there is now finally an acceptance within the medical and the psychological field of the use of psychotropic plants for the mental health pandemic that we've got. And suddenly you're seeing magic mushrooms being legalized in just about every state. But whoever would have thought you'd see that? And people using ayahuasca and using, other plant-based medicines. I've, peyote, etc. I've had
Yeah.
some small experience with that. And as you know, listeners, maybe you don't know what the indigenous people of all those cultures who use these things around the world say is that, well, we didn't discover the use of these plants. These plants discovered us, and we have a relationship to this plant. These plants have personalities and speak to us through our consciousness and our shamanic processes. And it wasn't a system of trial and error. Let's try this thing. Let's try this thing. Not at all. It's a very different process. And I think with what you're doing with braiding sweetgrass, you seem to be once again at the zeitgeist of when this becomes part of mainstream thought, just before it becomes part of mainstream thought. You did it with climate change. You did it with ice and coral. You did it with social media, with the social dilemma. Now you're doing it with plant-based medicines in relationship to the species. What is it, Ginny, that allows you to consistently and continually identify and tap the zeitgeist of what the human beings need before it hits the mainstream to help it hit the mainstream? Where does this quality come from? You hit it into the ballpark every time with your films.
I wish I could answer that. People have reflected that to me, like, well, how are you doing this? Like you got a good picker, you can I I think it's a bit mysterious. I think it's as simple as I have good instincts. When I met you and you just somewhat casually said to me, well, I have this idea about this book, and I have this idea about taking Rowan out, given some of your upbringing and history and connection to shamans and to healers, and it was forming for you, and there was just no question in my mind, no question, and it had to do with the quality of your heart. It wasn't just that you're actually happen to be brilliant and you actually have some of the most can-do motivational, capacities I've ever met. It was actually the quality of your heart. And I think I can tell that. It's like Robin Wall Kimmerer writing this book, you feel, she's not on a rampage or a campaign to convince anybody of anything. She's telling the story through her own heart, which tends to soften us and open us and generate something that makes it more acceptable to have things be in the mystery. And I would say my instincts have been developed over time to, meeting Jim Baylog, when I first met him and he told me about this crazy idea he had that was probably not going to work, to put these cameras out, and they didn't work. And people who watch the movie will know that. Like he was determined, but they all failed. These cameras failed because he was the first time they've ever been designed. But you could feel, and I feel it to this day when I'm with him, it's the quality of his heart. And that he had that in combination with a tremendous sense of vision and will, that I just feel like that those are the two kind of like, if there's a secret sauce or the secret ingredients, I think when I sense those coming together, it either in my being or in other people's beings that really are here doing what they're meant to be doing here, it's worth taking a risk and saying, oh, I support that. It's
Mentor a moment here, please. How can we, those listening, all of us, how can we learn to develop that muscle, to develop that skill of correctly discerning the quality of the human heart in front of us as we get involved with other people. What advice or tips would you give to people?
Well, even asking the question you're asking is the first question to ask, right? We tend to skip over that question. So if I'm meeting somebody who's all on fire about a project or they're an entrepreneur or whatever, to stop long enough, not just to go on the ride of the exhilaration possibility, but what's the quality of this human's heart? It, I don't mean that they have to be all kind of gushy and lovey, or it doesn't, but you have to sense where this whole passion is rooted. And, there are a lot of initiatives that don't make it. And I'm pretty convinced that part is that that's the carrier that's bigger than just even our will force and powers of manifestation. It's the human heart that actually knows what it loves and loves what it loves. And that's bigger than just that person. And if that hasn't been cultivated or developed or not known to that person, they might get there, of course. Trial and error will get us there. Because, I mean, this is frigging hard work. There's not a person out there listening that doesn't know that. Life is hard work now. Anything we want to achieve or accomplish requires an incredible amount of effort. So where that effort is coming from is, maybe somebody could say psychologically, this is the true integration of the masculine and feminine, right? Where there's this, this beautiful concert going on of deep, deep love for this existence. Whether we get to save it or not, I don't know, right? But if that heart isn't part of the driver and that has a natural softness to it and openness, willingness to learn as we go, willingness to listen, willingness to fail, willingness to hurt, to grieve, to be vulnerable, I just see that as just a kind of a critical. So I think the answer to your question is, ask the question.
That's a brilliant answer.
Ask the question.
Ask
What's
the
the
question,
quality?
what is the quality of this person's heart?
And you may not know, or you may be clueless, but it's a worthy question.
But at least it brings it into conversation, right?
Brings it into your consciousness.
Right.
Like just trying to feel where they're really living in their being.
Okay. Now the final thing.
Okay.
th- you're also an author, and I know you don't like this book that you wrote much, or at least you've told me that. But I like it. I like it for its humor, and it's also just really well written, and it's also mind blowing. And this book is called Clear Cut. It's by Ginny Jordan, the person you're listening to. And Ginny, you talked about this revelation coming to you through your experience with cancer. And you very modestly talked about it as if that was the only experience with it you've had, let alone Meniere's disease, let alone various other things. And before, Ginny, I want you to talk us through all the cancers you've been through and all the stuff you've been through and all the parts of you that have been cut. Before we go there, though, I want you listeners, you can't see what I'm seeing. So I'm looking at Ginny on the Zoom screen. Ginny is one of the most radiantly beautiful women I know, human beings. And yes, you're 70 years old and you don't look a day over 50. And you are the sort of person who, when we see you walking down the street, you look the picture of health. And yet, every single time I make contact with you, particularly when we haven't spoken for a year or two, which happens, you've always just come back from death's door. Can you, and this book Clear Cut tells some of those stories and what you've learned as you've lost parts of yourself. Can you just briefly tell us what you've gone through with sickness and loss of your body? And then from there, I want to go into something we can learn from this. So can you just please give us that rundown?
Well, as you said, it's been an enormous theme, one of the braids on my braid. So I did not know at the time when I was 35, as I mentioned, that I had what's called the BRCA2 gene, which is a genetic propensity for breast cancer that actually I got from my father.
Mm.
And, in the early days, we didn't have the test for that. So then I knew that. So I got breast cancer. So I had breast cancer on the right side. Then 15 years later, got breast cancer on the other side. And in between, I suffered a really horrific, another genetic disease that my mother and grandmother both had called Meniere's disease, which is an inner ear disorder where you're rendered kind of helpless with these attacks of violent vertigo. I mean, so bad that, I'd be bedridden for days. And there were a number of years where I couldn't drive a car, which was an enormous loss in terms of child rearing and being a mom and not being reliable, and let alone it being a pretty terrifying disease and experience to be, on the floor with the room like you just had, 20 pints of beer kind of experience. I mean, really violent. And I ended up having a treatment for that I tried every alternative you can imagine, and that was unsuccessful. That really did the trick. So I'm extremely grateful. But then I lost my hearing on that side, which was probably going, they predicted that would happen, but I was making a bid for life, that I could function and have a life. So we could chalk that up to a loss of not being able to hear. And of course, going through breast surgeries and losing breasts is an enormous, enormous loss. I mean, really unspeakable to a woman. That's, you got to go somewhere really much deeper than our culture to feel what makes us feminine beings. And what else? Hand surgery, another genetic problem that my father had, of being a true Viking. The only people who get this are Vikings. It's a hand thing called Dupuytren's contracture, where your fingers get scar tissue and your fingers start getting pulled down. And I had two very unsuccessful surgeries with that, so I'm kind of left with really kind of the use really of just one hand. Though I can use my other hand, it's a loss, of course. I'm trying to think what else. Oh, sort of another ongoing issue recently, just I was telling Rupert just before we started that I have a hard time pronouncing sometimes because my lip is all numb because I had suddenly a melanoma emerge on my lip last summer out of nowhere. And boom, we were having major surgery that was, pretty traumatic, as well as right on top of the heels of a hysterectomy, which, went actually brilliantly and kind of coordinated at the same time that I lost my mom. But there was that had an interesting translation as not a loss, which was kind of surprising. So there's been a lot. And, from one point of view, it's kind of a dramatic story constantly in so many ways over the years since I was 35. I don't take my body for granted, and sort of this constant story of remaking myself, being taken down. And, it's very mythic, right? Taken down into a kind of darkness and then having to raise myself back up. And then being taken down again, it's a bit of a Job story, and it's in a big drama sense. For Job, it was really dramatic. So it's been a powerful teacher for me, a powerful, path of sort of dissolution and renewal and resurrection. And also has absolutely forced me, as it does so many people who go through things right through the body, to really show up in the preciousness of this moment. I've almost died a few times, and it's like this is not abstract to me at all. And there's a power in living, waking up every morning and saying, thank you. Oh my God, I got another day. Thank you. So less has it made me paranoid and more insanely, insanely grateful. Just so grateful. And, why I'm still here is kind of in the mystery, but I'm on my knees in gratitude. So, loss, as we all know, because there's so many forms of loss, whether it's through the body or we lost our loved one. I lost one of my best friends this summer, or I mean, this winter. And, there's just always an opportunity through that pain to find a door that expands us even further, asks us to reach even deeper into life and be inside a mystery that's really beyond our understanding as well.
And through all this, listeners, despite having gone on to these large stages of film and the non-profit work, having, well, actually for-profit work, but philanthropically. So with the Street Business School and Bead for Life and all of this stuff, projecting you onto these sort of celeb level stages, you've continued to also just run a therapy practice for people. I've seen you go literally through fire and flood. So Ginny lives in a very beautiful river valley in Colorado, which sometimes flash floods. And when I first met you, you had built a stone circle and a cave in which you were bringing people back into, doing your therapy in there. Brilliant. And then, of course, this massive flood came in and washed it all away. And then there's been fire. But there's also been the renewal of that canyon that you live by. And again, for those of you who don't, well, of course you don't know, but bears walk past Ginny's window many mornings and sit in trees and look at her. And nature
Yep.
comes down this riparian corridor from the Rocky Mountains into the plains routinely whenever I've stayed at your house. Ginny, been lucky enough to do that. The wildlife has always been, one of the highlights. You just sort of sit in your front porch and you sort of watch these things come by. You keep this sort of humble therapy service going. What's next for you? What intrigues you to do next? What's your next offering? I know we're going to be looking out for braiding sweetgrass, but what's Ginny up to?
It's a great question. And when I turned 70, I really started to ask that. It's like, is the what's next an actual initiative project creation? Is it something simpler? Is it, I'm always sort of, as I said very early on, it's a call and response life. So I'm listening. I'm listening and hoping, inviting any particular synchronicity or how it is when we meet something and something lights up. I heard about something 2 days ago that I can't quite tell yet because I'm not allowed to, but if it were to manifest, it would be an amazing co-creation. But I'm just, really in a deep moment of pause and quietude, tending the hearth, so to speak, tending a number of souls that I'm deeply invested in their emergence and their growth. And it doesn't have a grand scale, nor does it need to be. So more than ever at this age and stage in life, when you're kind of in the third act, choicefulness and right placement becomes very important.
What
It's
do you
not
mean
like
by right placement?
placing myself in the right place for the right reason. It's like the expensive energy. When you're 20, your bandwidth is just a whole lot wider. But now how do I place with the right particular talents and gifts that I have? Likely it'll join others because that's my favorite thing to do. I'm not, the tip of the arrow. Usually it's more of a co-creative field, which I love. It's more stimulating for me. But, placing myself in the right moment for the right reason in the right place. I don't mean that's so like I have to like lose sleep over it, but it's got to feel aligned. And more than ever, I feel that it's like time is being measured now. And like, really, how do you want to spend your time? In what way? I'm super, super naturally involved, partly because I tend to a big piece of land. I live on 35 acres. I grow a lot of my own food now. I'm really fascinated with soil and the movement of soil and regenerative farming. And I'm very passionate about next generation. I mean, I feel completely in service to young people and their dreams and their visions and how I can serve and support them and elevate them and mirror them. I less have my shingle out as like, well, I'm some wise elder, that can I learn just as much. I mean, it's a beautiful flow and I'm happy to offer my gifts. And I love receiving the passion and the vision of this next generation and really want to be in, I want to live multi-generationally, and I do. There are different people who live on my land that are different ages, and that's super important to me.
So community, regenerative farming,
Yeah.
engagement, land, engagement with the next generation.
And
Uh,
some deep listening for something that I feel is actually gonna take me further than my land in Boulder and those beans right in front of me. I can feel that. I just don't know yet. I'll talk to you in a year, Rue.
okay. And
Hopefully before then.
hopefully, yeah, hopefully we'll actually make it face to face because I tried last year and you were having in hospital with that last thing of
Yeah,
yours.
there we go.
But now here you sit in front of me, radiant with good health, for which I'm grateful.
Yes, me too.
What would be your closing word of advice for somebody who is listening to this and feeling overwhelmed by the events of the time, Israel, Ukraine, climate, all of it?
Yeah,
What's your message of hope?
about that. Yeah, I'm asking that of myself a lot too, because I'm being a sensitive being. The moment I just heard the recent news with Iran, it's just, I didn't know what to do but go down and build a fire,
Perfect thing to do. Yeah.
yeah, I think for those that feel called and feel it's part of their path, part of the perhaps quest of these times is how can I grow myself to be the candle in the hurricane wind of the planet these days? How can I grow myself to be steady enough, take care of my own nervous system, be responsible for my own nervous system? Because by definition, just taking a breath is stressful on the planet. If we really want to analyze what we're breathing, right? What kind of air we really have, what we're drinking, just everywhere in all layers of life, it's just by definition. So no shame about being in stress because it is. Uncertainty is stressful. But I feel like our job and our quest is perhaps guides and future leaders and however we want to shape our lives, can we grow that, determination and strength of that light to be steady and be that, not by what we do, by how we are, by the emanation of our being, back to the quality of our heart and our capacity to feel joy, even in spite of all of this. That's a bright light that people need.
Is the first step to simply ask the question, how can I feel joy in these times?
Yeah, and real joy,
Yeah.
and not and unapologetically joyful. Unapologetically, because many people now are apologizing because, whoops, how can I have that when, you
Yeah.
know, Gazans are not, you know, the they have no food. It's like, how do you put all these paradoxes together? It's an impossible task. And so what is it, if, you know, you have to some in us somewhere assume that the highest aspect of all beings want us, so we can be joyful. Well, be joyful.
To be joy.
In this moment, we're not starving. Okay. We might just swing around. Who knows? Climate change hit me hard for 3 years. I lost pretty much every tree on my land. I mean, it was like, okay. And then I was one of those people. I mean, we're going to rotate around, but be joyful. And, what does that mean? What brings you joy?
Mm.
What really, really brings you joy? And it could be something so crazy. Like I really love playing games, board games.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. That's what I love. You better play some board games, Jenny.
Okay.
Right?
I would like to play a ball game with you next time I see you.
Hey, good. I'll teach you some cool ones.
Okay. I'm on. Yes. Joy. To be joy.
Yeah. To be
Doctor,
joy.
be
Yeah.
joy.
And it can take lots of shapes. I mean, it's not all like whoopee, but it's a quality where you keep your light on is what I'm trying to say. You
Did
you keep you
you,
keep yourself lit, and whatever ingredients you need to keep that yourself lit, that serves you and it serves everyone around you because they can feel.
yeah, because we all know that if someone else is not shining the candle and we can't see any light, then we despair.
Correct.
We're so grateful when someone is shining the candle.
Yeah. Even if it's subtle. And again, you can't mock it up. It's not a script. It's an arrival. It's a real arrival.
In the mentorship work and the therapy work you do, I know you're a very private person, so you don't necessarily have to give out a contact or anything like that, but I'm sure people would like to benefit from, reach out, learn more, read more. Are there any resources that you've got that people could go to?
Yeah, they're welcome to email me. They may not get a long one back 'cause I can't be behind a device for too long, but I love hearing from people. And if everybody's good with just not necessarily, 3-page response, I'm happy to give.
If people have a question that they would like to ask you in a
Yeah,
bit of advice,
that'd be the best way through my
so
email.
but just not be attached to you sending a
No,
long it's back. And
no,
perhaps you prefer them not to send you a 10-page epistle as well that glues you to the screen to read.
probably, yep. But
To be
I,
merciful to you.
I love to respond
Okay. So how
because
can people
that
reach you?
that's the cycle of life, call and response. So it's Ginny, Ginny,
Jordan. Yeah.
Jordan,
Jordan, Jordan. One word.
53, yep,
53
@gmail.com.
@gmail.com. All one word, lowercase. Ginny Jordan 53
Yeah,
@gmail.com.
that's a dead giveaway when I was born.
Hmm. Well, it must have been a good year.
It was.
Ginny, thank you.
Thank you, Rue. That was super fun.
I'm grateful. I'm grateful to know you. I'm grateful for the work that you do. I'm grateful you're in the world. I'm grateful you're my friend. Grateful. Thank you.
Thank you, Rue. So sweet to connect again. Let's do it soon. Okay.
All right. I'm
Much,
going to
much
press
love.
red button. Much love to you. Thank you for joining us. We hope you enjoyed today's podcast. Join our website, newtrailslearning.com, to check out our online courses and live workshops in Horseboy Method, Movement Method, and Athena. These evidence-based programs have helped children, veterans, and people dealing with trauma around the world. We also offer a horse training program and self-care program for riders on longridehome.com. These include easy-to-do online courses and tutorials that bring you and your horse joy. For an overview of all shows and programs, go to rupertisaacson.com. See you on the next show. And please remember to press subscribe and share.